show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show. Liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Yep, very, very much appreciated. Before we go on, a quick apology for the error in last week's episode of the show. Obviously, the sweet Italian wine is Marsala, not Madeira, as I incorrectly stated for the finish of the Tomintoul. Also, with regards to last week's episode of the show, viewer and good friend of mine, Andy Holdrup, pointed out that I was possibly a little bit grumpy at the beginning of last week's episode of the show. So, no grumpiness this week. In fact, one is a happy bunny. So, yeah, anyway. This week's episode of the show, as you can see from the title page, we're looking at a selection of bottlings from the independent bottling company Gleann Mor. Now, I think I've done an episode of on their bottlings in the past. If not an entire episode, I've certainly included them in an episode. I'm pretty certain about that. So there's no need to go into any sort of great deal of detail about the company, apart from one interesting fact that I didn't actually know until I was just doing a bit of reading on them. Is that they're apparently a shirt sponsor for Hibernian Football Club, the Scottish Football Club. That's quite cool. I certainly know absolutely nothing about Scottish football, so I wouldn't be able to comment on how good or bad Hibernian actually are, but anyway, there you have it. So just an interesting sort of piece of information. But anyway, obviously we're not really here to talk about football, because what I know about football you can probably write on the back of a postage stamp, I suppose. We're here to talk about whiskey, so let's take a look at today's one. Right, okay, so the bulk of these samples, actually 5 of them, all come from the last outrun of 2024 that Gleann Mor did, with the exception of the Cooley, which comes from the year before. Now, the reason I kind of like sat on the Cooley sample, for want of a better word, was that I had all intentions of actually doing an independent Irish episode of the show, but it just never happened. I either didn't get the samples together, or probably couldn't find them, which is often the case. I mean, certainly since obviously I redecorated the study. Can I find anything? No, they've all been shoved into new boxes and I can't find a thing. I mean, I was looking for a load of samples yesterday to do an episode of the show on, and could I find them? No, I found some other stuff, but couldn't find what I was looking for. But anyway, I think that's the name of a song, isn't it? But anyway, let's just look at the lineup. So we're going to kick off with an Aberfeldy. Now, Aberfeldy used to feature quite prominently in independent bottling companies' lists. Certainly, I remember A.D. Rattray used to do some bottlings, and like Duncan Taylor, and McPhail's. It was probably one of the most consistent bottlings in their Connoisseur's Choice range. Haven't seen it in the independent lists for ages now, obviously, because they don't sell it to the independents anymore. So we're going to kick off with a 13-year-old Aberfeldy. This is a refill bourbon hoggy, 8892, distilled in August of 2011, bottled last year at 56.8%. Bottling number 2 is the Cooley that I just mentioned. So this is a Caribbean rum cask finished Cooley. It's a 19-year-old, was distilled in 2002, bottled in 2021, and bottled at 53.8%. Sample came to me last year. Bottling number 3 is one of my favourite distilleries. Yeah, no, not being grumpy at all. This is a Deanston. Yes, indeed. God, well, you've got to slum it every now and again, haven't you? Mother. Anyway, so yeah, this is an 18-year-old Deanston. It is cask number 6766, and it spent 6 months finishing in a 12-month seasoned Oloroso cask, distilled in May of 2006, bottled in 2024 at 54.3%. So, yeah, Deanston and sherry finish. Well, we're going to love that one, aren't we? Next bottling is a Glenglassaugh. Now, again, another one that you don't see very much of in the independents lists these days. This is a 10-year-old Glenglassaugh. It is a refill sherry octave number 2080, distilled in May of 2014, bottled in 2024 at 54.2%. And another one you don't see very often anymore in the independent lists, and something with a bit of age, which is another rarity, it has to be said. This is a 35-year-old Jura. Yeah, now Jura nowadays, yeah, back in the day Jura produced some lovely spirits, so I'm hoping this is a back in the day bottling, as they say. A single refill bourbon Hoggy 8890, distilled in April of 1989, bottled in 2024 at 47.7%. And the last bottling is a bit of peat, because I always like to finish on a bit of peat. So this is from an undisclosed Islay distillery. It's just called, it's just an 11-year-old Islay. They put medium peated, whatever medium peat means. I mean, the thing is, I mean, now with Octomore, it kind of skews it all, doesn't it? I mean, back in the day before Octomore, 50 parts per million was considered to be high. So, but nowadays with Octomore, you know, nudging several hundred parts per million, it doesn't seem quite so high. So we'll assume it's sticking to the earlier sort of scale. We're probably looking at about 20-25%, or 25 parts per million, I should say. Anyway, so this has been aged in a first fill Oloroso hogshead, which apparently had been broken down from a butt, which had spent 20 years being used, as opposed to being just a seasoned Oloroso cask, and it had spent 15 months finishing after that. In another cask, a Bodegas Fundador sherry cask. So yeah, lots and lots of sherry, medium peat, distilled in April of 2013, bottled last year at 55.8%. Nothing wrong with a bit of peat and sherry, is there to finish off. So, and although when you think about all that sherry and first fill, well, I don't know if it said first fill, not a huge amount of colour in actual fact, and this is the thing, you know, you just don't know. I mean, you assume that sort of, you know, sherry seasoning, you know, it's not had very much sherry in the cask for very long. It's not going to absorb an awful lot of the, certainly the sherry character and colour. You would expect something that's been used for 20 odd years, maturing sherry would have imparted a lot more colour, but that's casks for you. Anyway, enough of that, let's taste some whiskey, so let's kick off with the Aberfeldy. Okay, so 13-year-old Aberfeldy, let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Quite dense, honeyed. It's got that lovely sort of fleshy, fruity Aberfeldy character, but there's a little bit of a spiritiness at the edge, a little bit of a rawness. It's not the most complex of Aberfeldies, but then young Aberfeldy never has been sort of like, you know, one that's going to blow you away with complexity. It's always been I think a sort of like a really nice quality whiskey, and certainly you can smell that this is a quality spirit. Just a little bit of a rawness to it. Maybe that's the alcohol. Maybe putting a little drop of water will kind of just knock some of that rawness back, possibly, but we shall see in a little while. Let's see what the palms like. You can certainly taste the alcohol on that. I mean, that grabs you by the wotsits, I can tell you. So it's quite fruity, pleasantly honeyed. It's got an almost kind of Sauternes-like late harvested honeyed character, and certainly I remember Aberfeldy always having this lovely, rich, robust, almost honeyed kind of character. There's some vanilla, a little bit of tangerine. Nice aftertaste after the sort of the alcohol has just, you know, pummeled the hell out of your tongue. It's got almost kind of like pollen-y kind of cereally character on the aftertaste. There's a touch of youthfulness there, it has to be said, and that alcohol kind of is emphasising that slight rawness to a certain degree. Let's put a little drop of water with it and see what that does to it. Okay, so that's brought out some lovely juicy citrus. It's emphasising the honey. I'm getting tangerine, and again that sort of slightly pollen heavy floral note on the nose. Yeah, I mean that's pleasant nose. That's kind of lost some of that sort of rawness because the alcohol has been kind of curtailed to a certain extent. Let's see what the palate's like. The palate's okay, it's pleasant, it's a little bit on the short side, it cuts off a little bit just after the mid palate, although it's got a little bit of green apple and cereal on the finish. It's relatively straightforward, it's lost some of the sort of Sauternes-like sort of complexity and the honeyed complexity. It's kind of a little bit more kind of straightforward, but it's mouth-filling, and like I said, it's now developed that little bit of green apple note coming through. Yeah, I mean it's pleasant, it's not a bad whisky at all, it's a nice start. Okay, so let's move on to the Cooley. So 19 years old, Caribbean rum cask finish. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Oh, that's nice, that's a lovely nose. Voluptuous, fruity, Alsace-like white fruits, honey, cereal, barley, tropical fruit, tropical rum, peach, banana. Oh God, that's good. And this is the whole sad thing about Cooley since it was sold to Beam Global. You know, it was a sort of innovation was in its DNA. It has to be said. And they've obviously been, you know, I mean, I don't know what are Beam doing with the casks these days. I mean, as far as I'm aware, you know, Beam just bottles it in the standard lineup that it does, ships it all out to the States because they love it out there. Well, they might not do so now when the tariffs kick in, but yeah, this is just absolutely stunning. Beautiful cask, lovely complexity, balanced, fragrant, just absolutely gorgeous. Now, I remember a certain wine merchant having this on the shelf, said it wasn't a cheap bottling, but my God, it's bloody good. Let's see what the palate's like. Oh, that's gorgeous. It kicks off with a sort of really full, fat, tropical, juicy fruit and coconut and vanilla, quite a lot of vanilla in actual fact. In comes the alcohol, brings in the citrus, the spice, the intensity. I mean, it's not too OTT alcohol wise, it is making my tongue tingle and mouth water. And then back comes the bourbon oak on the finish. I mean, that is a stunning whisky, it has to be said. It is just testament to the quality of the spirit that's produced at the distillery, it has to be said. And it's, like I say, a real shame that the distillery doesn't seem to be doing anything with it at the moment, which, anyway, but that's life, isn't it? Let's see what the nose gives us on this now. It's more juicy, more citric, just wonderfully aromatic. There's obviously a little bit more fatness of barley, a little bit more honey possibly, but it's not, I mean, although it's very aromatic, it's not sort of like, you know, an overt fruit monster. It's just beautifully balanced. Let's see what it passes like. Not quite so rummy now, it's a little drier, a little bit more barley, a little bit more barley husks. It's dry on the finish, but there's still a lovely juicy fruitiness, a touch of coconut still, a little bit more vanilla. Oh, that's stunning. Either way, whether, you know, neat or with a drop of water, that is a beautiful whiskey and a beautiful cask. So hats off to the guys for digging that one out, I'd say. Okay, so we go to this, from the sublime to the ridiculous. I don't know. This is the 18-year-old Deanston, finished in Oloroso cask. Let's see what the nose gives on this, then, shall we? A lot of sherry, dense, raisinated fruit, black grape, and I wouldn't quite go as far as saying a sherry monster, because I can pick up a little bit of industrial spirit underneath, a little bit of barley, some soapiness, isoferic acid, I believe. It's okay. I mean, you know, it's a sherry Deanston. It's not a sort of like the worst Deanston I've ever had in my life. It's not ripping my head off and you know, full of faints and sulphur and stuff. But it's Deanston. It's hard. You know, it's slightly industrial. There's a lot of sherry there, and well, I suppose on the positive side, you can't argue that they kind of go hand in hand. They do work together, you know, and that is the thing about the style of spirit produced at Deanston and Glenrothes and Glenfarclas and so on and so forth. The spirit works with sherry, you know. You can say that maybe the sherry kind of masks some of the roughness, but, well, you know, each to its own, as they say. Now, so I will say, as a bottling of Deanston, it's not too shabby. There's some distillery character, tick, or not, as the case may be, and there's some sherry character, tick, or not, as the case may be. Anyway, let's see what the pass up. That is woody. That is bloody woody. I mean, I'm going to pick the splinters out of my tongue, to be honest with you. Really woody, really tannic, dry, slightly bitter. Again, there's that industrial character. The alcohol is kind of keeping the sweet Oloroso's fruit intact. I mean, there's some raisinated fruit, a little bit of sultana, a little bit of dried apricot. But it's really tight and it's really woody, so I'm expecting a little drop of water may well actually unleash some of that sherry sweetness, and we'll see, shan't we? It's not made a great deal of change to the nose. It's still sherry. There's possibly a little bit more distillery character, shall we say? A little bit more of that soapiness, to be honest with you. A lot more soapiness in actual fact. Yeah. No cardboard though. Well, that's got to be a plus, hasn't it? Let's see what the palate's like now. There's a little bit more sweetness there. It's all pretty much now sort of pretty straightforward. There's a little bit of cardboard on the finish. Whoa. Where would Deanston be without a bit of cardboard, huh? Yeah, I'm not going to rave about this. It's a little bit more sweeter on the palate. It's a little bit more simpler. There's more sort of sour fruit and raisins and that kind of thing. And like I say, a little bit more sweetness, not as woody, not as dry, not as tannic, but there is a little bit more of that sort of like cardboardiness coming through. So, all in all, I mean, you know, I go on about balance and sort of distillery character and typicity and all that kind of stuff, and well, you can't argue that this does not have it. You know, whether you like that distillery character or not, of course, is another matter entirely, but you can't argue that it isn't balanced and it doesn't display distillery character. So okay, so moving on to the 10-year-old Glenglassaugh, so refill sherry octave, and again, you know, look at the colour. I would expect a lot heavier and darker colour from a sherry octave, so I'm guessing that this is probably a seasoned sherry octave, so maybe not seasoned for very long at all, so but we'll see. I don't get a huge amount of sherry. Yes, there is some sherry there, but it's kind of pretty much spirit orientated, and that spirit, although quite meaty and cereally, is a bit young. It's not really sort of developed an awful lot. So we got this meatiness, we've got the cereal, a bit of spice, a bit of dried fruit. It's all right. It's okay. It's like, you know, again, it's another one of those sort of spirits that you sort of like, or whiskies that you go, nothing wrong with it, absolutely fine, but it really should have done with a bit more time, to be honest with you. I mean, you know, Glenglassaugh is that type of spirit that really does need time in the cask. It is not a, it's not an easy one. It's not an easy spirit at all, which is why it had all its issues with its history, you know, because blenders didn't know what the hell to do with it. So it has a unique character, and I just think this is just a smidge too young. And I think maybe you could argue that they thought, stick it in the octave, let's see if we can get a bit of, you know, intense sherry character in there, and it hasn't quite gone according to plan. But like I said, it's not bad. Let's put the pass on. More sherry than the nose, sweeter, more raisinated fruit, sultana, bit of prune, bit of bitter licorice on the aftertaste. There's a sort of an underlying sort of weight to the spirit, but I'm not getting an awful lot of actual spirit character, as we said. Although it's not punching me with sherry, it is the most sort of like dominant part of, which, you know, considering it's a sherry octave, is not a surprise. Let's put a little drop of water and see whether that opens things out or not. Yeah, it's kind of brought more of the spirit out on the nose. There's some grilled nuts. It's still cereally. It's still quite meaty. There's a slight faintiness there as well. It's kind of almost leaving the spirit exposed, if you like, and it's showing that the spirit is just hasn't reached an optimum maturity, in my personal opinion. Let's see what the palate's like. The palate likewise, it's stripped away the sherry and you are left with young, immature, cereally, slightly fainty spirit that really should have spent more time in the cask before being stuck in a bottle, in my personal opinion. Yes, I know it's Glenglassaugh, it's interesting, get the thing out there, but, you know, each cask has its kind of point where it should be bottled, and I think this one, was just bottled a little bit too soon. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Jura. So 35-year-old Jura, I don't think you can say that this has been bottled too soon, but we'll see what this is like. Okay, yep, it's pleasantly mature. There is some sawdusty vanilla, some honey, dried fruit, you know, as in dried oxidised fruit. But, and here's the but, I think this is probably a little too old. There is a little bit of sort of raw kind of rose petally spirit. It's kind of strange how whiskey works. It sort of starts off with this, often with this kind of rawness, this rose petal, this kind of Mari like character. It then hits a sort of a maturity point, and then we kind of start to dip off a bit, you know, the fruitiness maybe starts to disappear, and it starts to leave a little bit more raw kind of spirit. Now, it's a bit of linseed oil, white fruit, peanut dust, almond, but it just feels too old. Now, if this was my cask, I would have bottled this at least 5 years earlier, probably even 10 years earlier, to be honest with you. It's just, it's tired. And this was not a cheap bottling. I mean, I think this, I mean, it was definitely three figures. I think, what was it? I think it was about £450. And yeah, I can't go with it. You know, it's just too old. It's not knackered, but it's been bottled too late. I mean, and I suspect that this was a cask that was picked up with some serious age. This is probably not something that Gleann Mor have been sitting on for the last decade or so, and they probably picked it up, I wouldn't say on the cheap, but personally, if it was me, I would have passed on this. Let's see what the pass on. The palate is like the nose. It has some lovely maturity, but it's just too old. It's starting to creak and it's gone beyond. It's short. It's got that rose petally kind of marry spirit coming through, and it's just basically been just bottled too late at the end of the day. You know, the spirit though, in giving it that, if you kind of almost ignore the kind of the overly aged characteristic and the fact that it's lost some of its spirit, I think the spirit was actually very, very good, which is, or feeds into my belief system and narrative about the fact that back in the day Jura produced, and I know for a fact, I mean, I don't know what I'm saying is feeds into my narrative, but you know, back in the day Jura did produce a lovely fruity spirit, and somewhere along the lines it kind of all went a bit horribly Pete Tong, as they say, and I think it, as I've said on numerous occasions, I think it's more to do with sort of like commercialism and the fact that distilleries like Jura and Highland Park and so on and so forth became too popular, that they basically pushed the spirit, bottled it too young, and, you know, pushed those poor old stills to hell and high, you know, kingdom come. But back in the day when there was not quite the sort of like the demand, you know, it allowed them to kind of like sort of distill a lot slower pace, and produce a beautiful spirit. And I think if this had been bottled at least 10 years ago, 5 years at the very minimum, at least 10 years ago, this would have been absolutely stunning, and you would have said, yep, 450 quid, I would have quite happily parted with that. But now, too old, not worth it. That's what I think. Okay, so on to the final bottling of the day. This is the 11-year-old Islay. Probably Cooley, I would imagine, but let's see what those goes. Dense, tarry, peaty, meaty, sherried, mentholated, peppery. What's not like to like? I mean, you know, it kind of, you know, I bang on about distillery character and balance and blah blah blah, and sometimes, you know, peat and sherry just works. I mean, it does. It just seems to just be a match made in heaven. It's intertwined, if you like, and I suppose, I mean, I'm pretty much certain this is Kalila. It has that sort of slight, sort of fresh top note, and a little bit of mentholated spirit, mentholated herbal sort of peatiness, and this is the thing about Kalila. It has various faces, and it is very different, and it can sort of come across like Lefroy, for example, with that sort of intense medicinal character. It can sometimes come across completely different, and what's not to like? Really, really classic peat and sherry. Let's see what the pass on. That's pretty masked. Ashy, lovely ashy aftertaste. Although 100% sort of sherry matured in its various formats, I get quite a lot of vanilla to kick off with, a lot of vanillans, and at the end of the day, oak, whether it's European or American, contains vanillans, and you know, in American white oak it's a little bit more predominant than in European oak, but it's still there, and every now and again you can get this kind of vanilla character coming through, and that actually has an awful lot of it. Subtler on the peat, a little bit more maltiness, a little bit more tarriness, chewy. I mean, it is what it is at the end of the day. I mean, you know, you're not going to go too far wrong. I mean, like I said, it takes an awful lot to cock up a bottling of Cooley at the end of the day. That it has been done, I will tell you, but you know, it takes an awful lot. Yeah, it's not taking water quite so well as I was expecting. There's a rawness there, an oily rawness that the sherry just seems to have kind of like just evaporated into thin air. There's not much peat, it's kind of oily, raw spirit. That was a bit of a curveball, I wasn't expecting that one. Let's see what the palate's like. Yeah, that's not, water's not done that really any favours. Like I said, the sherry is dissipated, the peat is dissipated, we've got oily spirit character. It's okay, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's just kind of like, where's the complexity gone? It's just sort of like disappeared into the ether, and it's kind of like, well, that's a bit of a disappointment at the end of the day, which is a real shame, because that was lovely, that was really quite pleasant, but put a little drop of water with it and it all goes a bit Okay, so that's some today's episode of the show. Firstly, a big thank you to the guys at Gleann Mor for the samples for today's episode of the show. Hopefully you'll agree that a fair appraisal. I thought the Aberfeldy was okay. I thought it was possibly bottled a bit too young, and this is where we all get a little bit fixated with age statements. It's kind of like, oh, it's 10 years old, it's 15 years old, we need to bottle it. It doesn't work like that at the end of the day. Every cask has its, you know, sweet spots, shall we say, and sometimes you just, I know, with independence there's the money aspect, there's the, you know, we need to bottle something, we bought this bloody cask, and not every independent has the luxury of sitting on stock forever and a day, or until it's deemed ready for bottling. Or, I mean, it could be that whoever is deciding upon, you know, the bottlings, you know, for Gleann Mor thought that was ready for bottling. Okay, I can live with that. I disagree with that personally, but then that's my personal opinion. I thought that, like I say, it was a nice Aberfeldy. It showed a lot of promise. It was just bottled too soon. On the other hand, the Cooley was just bloody good. I mean, you know, not a lot other to say about that apart from wow, complexity, you know, character, balance, just a beautiful whiskey. And just going to show that, you know, that whoever was picking these casks can occasionally pick a bloody good cask, it has to be said. And you can argue that the Deanston was a good cask, you know, if you forget the distillery, it was balanced. It had sherry character, it had sort of distillery character, you know, and well, in that aspect, from a technical point of view, you can't argue with it. You know, whether you like the distillery or not, of course, is secondary to the fact that it was actually for the distillery. It was, you know, it was bottled about at the right time, I think. Unlike the Glenglassaugh, which I think was bottled too young again, and this seems to be a bit of an overriding factor here with Gleann Mor, and you know, not wishing to be overly critical, but from what I've tasted so far, we are bottling a little bit too soon, and I think the Glenglassaugh again could have done with a few more years before sticking that one out. And you could argue that putting it into the octave was trying a little bit too hard to sort of, like, you know, push that one out sooner rather than later. And you know, we all know that these are tricks of the trade. That you know, you have some whiskey that's maybe not quite there, you know, shove it in the small cask, get some cask character in there. The trouble is, of course, that you can't ever cheat time. You know, the amount of times I've tasted these sort of whiskies that have either had chips shoved in them or small casks and things like that. Yeah, they've got a lot of oak character, but the spirit is not mature, and that is the key point, that you cannot cheat time. The same can be said of the Jura, and then bizarrely in this angle, it was bottled too late, and I suspect it was because this was an old cask. It was bought pretty much as is and was bottled as is, and it really, I wouldn't have bothered personally. And the 11-year-old Islay, neat. It was absolutely spot on. It was peat and sherry. It was absolutely fine. It didn't take water particularly well, and so for me, it was not something that would really interest me. So overall, again, a sort of a mixed bag, and no different to practically any other independent bottling company I've come across, and I've had the fortune to taste. Some lovely stuff. I think that for me, like I said, some of the stuff was bottled a bit too soon, and but you know, like I said, there's always those kind of monetaristic things that you have to sort of deal with. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of the show. All that's left to say is good afternoon and good ramming.